Assalamualaikum. Greetings, everyone. My name is Nana Firman, and I am a PhD student at Chicago Theological Seminary. This is a lecture on historical cases for Islam and Ecology course. And today, I would like to invite us to rethink a question that often seems obvious, but it is actually deeply contested. What is nature? In many modern societies, nature is understood primarily as a collection of resources. Forests become timber, rivers become water supplies, animals become commodities, and land becomes property or economic capital. Meanwhile, religion is often treated as something private, concerned with personal belief or salvation, rather than ecological relationships. The two primary readings for this session challenge these assumptions from different directions. Alan Mikhail in Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt argues that nature is not simply the backdrop to human history. Instead, rivers, animals, climates, and landscapes actively shape political power, economic systems, and imperial governance. In other words, ecology is not peripheral to history. It is one of history's central actors. While Ingrid Mattson approaches the question from theology. In Rethinking Islam and Animism, she argues that the Quran presents a world in which humans are not isolated individuals standing above nature, but members of a much larger community of created beings. Animals, plants, mountains, rivers, and even the earth itself participate in worship, glorifying God and possess their own forms of dignity and purpose. Together, these two works suggest something profound. Islamic environmental thought has never separated ecology from theology, politics, or ethics. Rather than seeing nature as an object to dominate, these authors invite us to rediscover creation as a living community sustained by God. That broader vision will guide our discussion today. Before turning to the historical and theological arguments, I want us to reflect on the assumptions that shape modern environmental thinking. Many environmental discussions today focus on technological solutions like renewable energy, carbon capture, conservation policies, or sustainable development. These are all important, yet several of the scholars we've read previously suggest that the ecological crisis is not only technological or political, it is also a crisis of imagination. Professor Said Hussein Nasser argues that modern civilization gradually desacralized nature. As scientific and industrial revolutions transformed society, nature increasingly came to be understood as inert matter, something measurable, exploitable, and economically useful. Once nature lost its sacred character, exploitation became morally easier. Similarly, Hajfasun Khalid argues that today's climate crisis reflects a deeper spiritual imbalance. Human beings increasingly see themselves as owners of the earth rather than trustees accountable to God. Unlimited economic growth, consumerism, and extractive development have replaced the Quranic principles of balance or mizan, moderation, and justice. This diagnosis challenges us to think differently. Perhaps climate change is not simply the result of poor technology or inadequate policy. Perhaps it also reflects a distorted relationship between humans and the race of creation. The readings today invite us to recover an older imagination, one in which ecology is inseparable from ethics, worship, and responsibility. Nasser's contribution is especially important because he shifts our attention from environmental symptoms to their underlying causes. He argues that the modern ecological crisis originates in a spiritual crisis. According to Nasser, traditional religious civilizations generally viewed the natural world as a sacred manifestation of divine wisdom. Mountains, rivers, forests, and animals were not worshipped, but they were respected because they reflected God's creative power and served as signs, or ayat, pointing towards the Creator. Modernity, however, gradually separated humanity from this sacred worldview. Nature became a machine to be analyzed, controlled, and exploited. Scientific knowledge itself is not the problem. Rather, the problem arises when science is detached from ethics and spirituality. This perspective resonates strongly with the Quranic language. The Quran repeatedly describes the natural world as filled with signs of God, inviting human beings to observe, reflect, and cultivate gratitude rather than domination. Nasser therefore asks us to reconsider not simply how we manage nature, but how we perceive it. If we no longer recognize creation as sacred, environmental destruction becomes not only possible but almost inevitable. This insight prepares us well for Michael's historical analysis because it reminds us that our understanding of nature profoundly shapes how societies govern and interact with the environment. Building on Nasser's diagnosis, Khalid asks a practical questions. What does Islam contribute to the contemporary climate crisis? Khalid argues that Islam does not begin with environmental policy, but with worldview. Central Quranic concepts such as Tawheed, the unity of God, Mizan, the balance established within creation, and Khilafah, human trusteeships, together provide an ethical framework for ecological responsibility. One of the most important concept is Mizan, described beautifully in Surah Ar-Rahman.
والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان.
And the heaven he raised, and he established the balance so that you do not transgress the balance. From Surah Ar-Rahman, verses 7 and 8. For Khalid, climate change represents precisely this transgression of balance. Excessive consumption, fossil fuel dependence, ecological degradation, and economic systems built on limitless growth all reflect humanity's failure to respect the divinely established order of creation. Rather than seeing environmentalism as a modern addition to Islam, Khalid argued that the ecological care emerges naturally from the Quranic worldview itself. Caring for the earth is therefore not merely a political choice, it is a religious and moral obligation grounded in faith. This ethical framework provides an important bridge between Nasser's philosophical critique and the historical realities we encounter in Ottoman Egypt. Having established this broader context, I would like us to organize today's discussion around four guiding questions. First, how does nature shape history? This is Alan Michael's central contribution. Rather than viewing rivers, animals, climate, and agriculture as passive background conditions, he demonstrates that they actively shape the rise and maintenance of Ottoman rule in Egypt. Environmental history becomes political history. And second, who belongs to God's community of creation? This question guides Ingrid Mattson's theological exploration. She argues that the Quran consistently portrays animals, plants, and the earth itself as communities that know, worship, and glorify God. Humans therefore exist within, not outside, that broader community. And third, what responsibilities do humans bear? Here we'll draw on Ibrahim Osdemir, Sarah Trilli, and Farhana Meyer to explore concepts such as khilafah, amana, and mizan. Together they challenge interpretations of stewardship that justify domination and instead emphasize responsibility, humility, compassion, and justice. And finally, how should Muslims live today? Anagate reminds us that Islamic environmental ethics is not only a matter of theological principles, but also of lived practice. Everyday acts such as using water responsibly, caring for animals, cultivating gratitude, fasting during Ramadan, and engaging in charitable stewardship become ecological practices rooted in worship. As we move into the next section, we'll begin with Alan Michael's environmental history of Ottoman Egypt, where we will see that ecology was not simply the setting for empire. It was one of the forces that made empire possible. When we think about history, we often focus on rulers, wars, political decisions, or economic systems. Nature tends to appear only as the backdrop against which human events unfold. Alan Michaels invites us to reverse that perspective. His central argument is that nature is not merely the stage of history, it is one of its principal actors. The Ottoman Empire in Egypt cannot be understood apart from the ecological systems that sustained it, particularly the Nile River. Instead of writing a history about nature, Michael writes a history in which humans and non-human forces constantly shape one another. This approach belongs to what historians call environmental history, a field that examines how landscapes, climate, water, plants, animals, disease, and human societies interact over time. Rather than separating natural history from human history, environmental historians see them as inseparable. Throughout the book, Mikhail demonstrates that political authority, agricultural production, taxation, and even imperial stability depended on ecological conditions. Floods, droughts, irrigation systems, animal labor, and soil fertility were not peripheral concerns. They were fundamental to how the empire functioned. One of the most striking aspects of Mikhail's work is that he gives agency to the natural world. He does not suggest that rivers or climates possess human intentions, but he argues that they exercise real influence over historical outcomes. Human beings make decisions, yet those decisions are always constrained and enabled by ecological realities. This perspective resonates with what we discussed earlier. If modernity often imagines humans as masters of nature, Michaels reminds us that even powerful empires remain profoundly dependent upon the environments they sought to govern. At the heart of Michael's narrative is the Nile River. Egypt has often been called the gift of the Nile, but Michael pushes this familiar phrase much further. He argues that the Nile was not simply a resource used by the Ottoman state. It functioned almost as an imperial partner whose seasonal rhythms determined the possibilities of governance. Each year, the annual flood replenished agricultural lands with the fertile silt, making large-scale farming possible. These floods supported food production, generated tax revenue, sustained urban populations, and ultimately financed the Ottoman Empire. If the flood was too low, crops failed and famine threatened. If it was too high, villages, infrastructures, and fields could be damaged. The empire therefore depended on a delicate ecological balance that no ruler could fully control. This insight challenges the common assumption that political power flows only from military strength or administrative efficiency. In Ottoman Egypt, imperial authority also depended on environmental stability. As Mikhail repeatedly demonstrates, no amount of political planning could eliminate dependence on the Nile's natural cycles. Here we begin to see an important theological resonance with the Quranic concept of mizan, or balance. Although Mikhail writes as a historian rather than a theologian, his work illustrates that human flourishing depends upon respecting ecological limits rather than imagining complete mastery over nature. The Nile, in this sense, becomes a reminder that human power is always contingent. Even empires must negotiate with the natural world. Another significant contribution of Mikhail's work is that he encourages us to think in terms of systems rather than isolated events. The Ottoman Empire was not sustained by a single river alone. It depended upon an intricate network of relationships linking humans, animals, water, labor, technology, and political institutions. Consider the irrigation canals that carried Nile water to agricultural fields. These canals required constant maintenance. peasant dug and repaired them. Animals such as oxen powered agricultural work. Local officials coordinated labor, and imperial administrators relied on this entire system to generate tax revenue. Every part of the network depended upon the others. This system's perspective reminds us that environmental governance was fundamentally collaborative. The state could issue regulations, but it could not produce water, control floods, or cultivate crops independently. Political authority depended upon cooperation with ecological processes and local environmental knowledge accumulated over generations. Interestingly, this historical picture aligns with contemporary ecological thinking. Modern ecology emphasizes that ecosystems function through relationships rather than isolated components. Mikhail shows that the same principle applied historically to human societies. Empire itself was an ecological system. This insight also prepares us for Ingrid Matsson's theological argument. If Mikhail describes networks of ecological interdependence from the perspective of history, Matsson will later describe a much larger network, the community of creation itself, in which humans participate alongside animals, plants, and the earth before God. One of the most important lessons from Mikhail's work is that the Ottoman Empire never achieved complete control over nature. Instead, imperial governance consisted largely of negotiating with ecological realities that remained beyond human command. Modern societies often celebrate technological progress as evidence that humans can overcome natural limits. While technological innovation certainly expands our capabilities, Mikhail reminds us that ecological systems continue to shape human possibilities. Floods, droughts, failures, disease, and changing environmental conditions repeatedly forced Ottoman officials to adapt their policies. These observations connects beautifully with Said Hussein Nasser's critique of modernity. Nasser argues that one of modern civilization's deepest illusions is the belief that humanity has become autonomous from nature. Mikhail's historical evidence suggests otherwise. Even one of the world's most sophisticated empires remained dependent upon forces it could never fully master. The Quran offers a similar reminder through the concept of mizan, the balance established by God within creation. As I mentioned earlier in Surah Ar-Rahman, verses 7 and 8. Rather than portraying balance as merely a moral ideal, Mikhail's history illustrates balance as a practical necessity. When ecological relationships became unstable, political and economic stability also suffered. This challenges modern assumptions that environmental degradation is simply an external problem. Ecological imbalance inevitably becomes social, political, and economic imbalance as well. As we conclude this section, let me highlight three enduring insights from Alan Mikhail's work that will guide the rest of our discussion. First, nature possesses historical agency. Michels encourages us to recognize rivers, climate, animals, soils, and disease not as passive scenery, but as active forces shaping the course of history. While they do not make conscious decision as humans do, they influence what human societies can and cannot accomplish. Second, political power depends upon ecological systems. The Ottoman Empire did not stand above nature. It existed within ecological relationships. Agricultural production, taxation, public works, and imperial governance all relied upon healthy environmental systems. Political authority was therefore inseparable from environmental stewardship. Third, environmental governance requires humility. Mikhail does not romanticize Ottoman rule. He acknowledges exploitation, inequality, and the burdens placed upon peasants through taxation and labor obligations. Nevertheless, his history demonstrates that human societies ignore ecological realities at their peril. No empire, however powerful, can permanently escape dependence upon the natural world. These historical insights create a fascinating bridge to Ingrid Matsson's theological argument. Michels has shown us that humans are ecologically dependent. Matsson will now ask a deeper question. What if that dependence is not merely biological or economic, but also spiritual? In the next section, we move from the environmental history of Ottoman Egypt to the Quranic vision of creation as a community of beings who each possesses their own dignity, purpose, and relationship with God. Here, history and theology begin to converge in a shared critique of human exceptionalism. Having explored how ecology shapes history through Mikhail's environmental lens, we now turn to Ingrid Matsson, who asks an even more fundamental question. How does the Quran imagine the world itself? Matsson argues that many modern people, whether religious or secular, have inherited a worldview in which humans stand apart from nature. We often divide reality into subjects and objects. Humans think and act, while everything else simply exists for human use. This assumption is so familiar that we rarely question it. The Quran, however, presents a remarkably different picture. Rather than portraying humanity as isolated from the rest of creation, it repeatedly situates humans within a vast community of created beings. One of the created expression of this vision appears in Surah Al-An'am.
وما من دابة في الأرض ولا طائر يطير بجناحيه إلا أمم أمثالكم.
There is no creature on earth nor bird flying with its wings except that they are communities like you. From Surah Al-An'am, verse 38. Matsson pays careful attention to this verse. The Quran does not merely say that animals exist or that they deserve kindness. It calls them communities or ummam, using the same language that is often used for human societies. This suggests that animals possess their own forms of social organization, purpose, and relationship with God. This verse immediately challenges human exceptionalism. Human beings are certainly entrusted with unique moral responsibilities, but they are not the only meaningful members of creation. The Quranic world is populated by many communities, each created by God and each participating in the divine order. As we continue through this section, notice how this single verse begins to reshape our understanding of ethics, spirituality, and ecology. Madsen then expands this argument by drawing our attention to one of the Quran's most beautiful and often overlooked themes: all creation worships God. Several verses express this idea in different ways. One of them is in Surah Al-Isra.
تسبح له السماوات السبع والأرض ومن فيهن وإن من شيء إلا يسبح بحمده ولكن لا تفقهون تسبيحهم.
The seven heavens and the earth and all that is in them glorify him. There is not a thing except that it celebrates his praise, though you do not understand their glorification. From Surah Al-Isra, verse 44. Similarly, Surah An-Nur describes birds in flight as knowing their own prayers and praise.
ألم تر أن الله يسبح له من في السماوات والأرض والطير صافات كل قد علم صلاته وتسبيحه.
Do you not see that Allah is glorified by all those in the heavens and the earth, even the birds as they soar? Each instinctively knows their manner of prayer and glorification. From Surah An-Nur, verse 41. While Surah Ar-Rahman poetically tells us that the stars and trees bow in prostration before God.
والنجم والشجر يسجدان.
The stars and the trees bow down in submission. From Surah Ar-Rahman, verse 6. Madsen argues that these verses should not be dismissed as a mere literary metaphors. Instead, they reveal something profound about Islamic cosmology. Worship is not limited to human beings. The entire universe exists in a state of remembrance of God, although human beings often fail to perceive it. This perspective transforms how we think about nature. A forest is no longer simply a collection of biological organisms. It becomes a congregation of creatures engaged in glorification. Rivers, mountains, birds, and trees are not spiritually empty matter, but participants in a cosmic liturgy. Farhana Meyer develops this insight by emphasizing that the Quran repeatedly calls natural phenomena ayat or signs. Creation is not only evidence of God's existence, but also a living testimony to God's wisdom, beauty, and sustaining power. Observing nature, therefore, becomes a spiritual practice of reflection or tafakkur rather than merely scientific observation. In this way, ecology becomes inseparable from theology. If the Quran portrays animals as communities that worship God, what does this mean for human ethics? This is where Sarah Tilili's work becomes especially illuminating. Rather than beginning with philosophical theories about animal rights, Tilili turns to the Hadith literature and asks how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, related to animals. Many of these narrations are remarkably striking. One famous hadith tells of a camel that approached the Prophet and appeared to complain about its mistreatment by its owner. Rather than dismissing the animal's distress, the Prophet listened, investigated the situation, and instructed the owner to treat the camel with greater compassion. Another narration describes the Prophet returning baby birds to their distressed mother after companions had taken them from the nest. In yet another hadith, a woman is condemned for imprisoning a cat until it died of starvation, while another person is forgiven by God for giving water to a thirsty dog. These stories reveal something remarkable. Animals are not merely objects of human mercy. They are portrayed as beings with experiences, vulnerabilities, and moral significance. Their suffering matters to God. Tilili argues that prophets' interaction consistently recognize animals as fellow creatures endowed with dignity. Compassion toward animals is therefore not sentimental kindness, but an expression of justice rooted in the recognition that they too belong to God's creation. Matson's theological argument and Tilili's ethical analysis reinforce one another beautifully. If animals are communities that worship God, then ethical treatment of animals become part of honoring God's wider community of creation. At this point, we can begin to see how the central theological principle of Islam, Tawheed, the oneness of God, extends far beyond questions of doctrine. Farhana Meir argues that Tawheed is not simply the affirmation that there is only one God. It also shapes how Muslims understand the unity and the interconnectedness of creation. Because one creator sustains all beings, creation itself forms an interconnected whole rather than a collection of unrelated objects. This unity is expressed through another important Quranic concept, mizan or balance. The Quran teaches that God established balance within creation and warns humanity not to disrupt it. Ecological balance therefore reflects divine wisdom. Notice how this complements Mikkel's historical argument. In Ottoman Egypt, political stability depended upon ecological balance within the Nile system. Meyer reminds us that this balance also possesses theological significance. Environmental equilibrium is not merely scientifically desirable, it reflects God's ordering of creation. Meyer also draws interesting parallels with Pope Francis' Laudato Si. Although emerging from different religious traditions, both perspectives reject the fragmentation of modern thought. They insist that environmental degradation, social injustice, and spiritual alienation cannot be separated because they arise from the same distorted relationship with creation. In this sense, Tawheed encourages us to see relationships where modern thinking often sees isolated parts. God, humanity, animals, water, soil, and future generations all exist within an interconnected web sustained by the Creator. One of the most frequently cited Islamic environmental concepts is khilafah, often translated as stewardship or trusteeship. Yet, as Ibrahim Osdemir argues, this concept is frequently misunderstood. Some interpretations have used stewardship language in ways that still place humans above nature, as though humans are benevolent managers exercising authority over passive resources. Osdemir challenges this reading by returning to the Quranic context. Human beings are indeed entrusted with responsibility, but trusteeship does not imply ownership. A trustee cares for something that ultimately belongs to someone else. In Islam, the earth belongs to God, not to humanity. Human beings, therefore, exercise responsibility under divine accountability rather than absolute control. This understanding is closely connected to the concept of amana or trust. The environment is not private property or to exploit without limits. It is a trust temporarily placed in human hands. Every decision regarding water, land, animal, forests, or future generation, therefore, carries ethical significance. Here we can also reconnect with Fazlul Khalid's early critique. Modern environmental crises often arise because humans behave as owners instead of trustees. The Quranic vision calls for humility, restraint, and justice. Taken together, Matson, Mayer, Tilili, and Osdemir offer a powerful alternative to modern anthropocentrism. Human beings are unique not because they possess unlimited rights over creation, but because they bear unique responsibilities toward it. As we conclude this theological section, I want to return to the verse that has quietly guided our entire discussion, which is Surah Al An'am, verse 38. This verse encapsulates what I think is Ingrid Matsson's most significant contribution. She invites us to rethink not only how we treat nature, but how we understand our own identity. Modern culture often defines humanity by separation. We are rational, while animals are instinctive. We possess culture, while nature is wild. We are subjects, while everything else is become an object. Matheson shows that the Quran begins from a different premise. Humans are one community among many communities created by God. Our distinct moral responsibility does not remove us from creation, it binds us more deeply to it. When we place Ingrid Mattson along Alan Michael, a compelling synthesis emerges. Michael demonstrates historically that empires depended upon ecological systems they could never fully control. Mattson reveals theologically that those ecological systems are not merely material processes, but fellow members of God's living creation. Together, these readings dismantle two common modern assumptions. First, they reject the idea that religion belongs only to the private spheres while ecology belongs only to science or politics. Second, they reject the notion that humans exist outside or above the natural world. Instead, they invite us into what we might call an Islamic ecology of relationship, one grounded in Tawheed, expressed through Mizan, practiced through Khilafah and Amana, and animated by the recognition that all creation participates in the praise of God. As we move into our final section, we will ask what this vision means for contemporary Muslim life and environmental practice. Here, Anna Gate helps us see that these theological principles are not abstract ideas, but habits of worship that can reshape everyday ecological living. After exploring the historical and theological dimensions of Islamic ecology, we now arrive at an important question. How does this worldview become lived practice? This is where Anna Gates' work on Muslim environmentalism becomes especially valuable. Gate reminds us that Islamic environmental ethics should not be understood only as a collection of theological principles or scriptural interpretations. Rather, ecological values are embedded within everyday religious practices, social institutions, and community traditions. In other words, Islam does not separate belief from practice. Concepts such as Tawheed, Mizan, Khilafah, and Rahmah become meaningful through how Muslims interact with the world around them. Consider several examples. Water is not simply a physical resource. It is connected to purification, prayer, and gratitude. The practice of wudu teaches awareness of water usage and discourages waste. Fasting during Ramadan is not only spiritual discipline but also a practice of restraint, reminding believers that human desires must be balanced. Charity or sadaqah and zakah extend beyond human communities and can include care for animals and the natural environment. Gardens, agricultural traditions, and conservation practices historically reflected a recognition that human practice in rather than stand outside of ecological system. Gates' contribution is important because it prevents Islamic environmental ethics from becoming merely theoretical. Ecology is not something added to Islam from outside. Rather, environmental consciousness emerges from within Islamic practices of worship, community, and moral formation. This section brings together a theme that appears throughout all our readings. Ecological responsibility is a form of worship because it reflects the proper relationship between humans, God, and creation. In many modern environmental discussions, ecological action is framed primarily in terms of crisis management, reducing emissions, conserving resources, or protecting endangered species. These actions are necessary, but Islamic environmental thought adds another dimension. It asks not only what should we do, but also what kind of relationship with creation should we cultivate. For example, conserving water is not merely a practical environmental behavior. It reflects humility before God's creation and recognition that water is a blessing entrusted to humanity. Caring for animals is not simply compassion toward vulnerable beings, as Sarah Tilly demonstrates through Hadith traditions. Kindness towards animals expresses recognition that they have their own relationship with God. Planting trees or restoring ecosystems is not only ecological restoration, it can also become an act of ongoing charity as sadaqah jariyah because its benefits continue beyond the individual. This perspective challenges a common modern separation between spirituality and environmentalism. In Islamic thought, caring for creation is not separate from devotion to God. Rather, it is one way believers practice and participate in the divine order. The ecological question therefore becomes a spiritual question. How do we live responsibly within a world that does not belong to us but has been entrusted to us? At this point, we can bring the different voices together and recognize that each scholar has contributed a different dimension of the same ecological vision. Said Hussein Nasser provides the philosophical diagnosis. The ecological crisis is rooted in a spiritual crisis caused by the loss of sacred meaning in nature. Fazun Khalid translates this insight into contemporary environmental ethics by emphasizing that climate change reflects a violation of Quranic principles of balance, justice, and responsibility. Alan Michael provides historical evidence that ecological systems have always shaped human societies. His study of Ottoman Egypt demonstrates that even powerful empires remain dependent upon rivers, landscapes, animals, and climate. Ingrid Mattson provides the theological foundation. Creation is not merely a collection of resources, but a community of beings connected through worship of God. Sarah Tilili demonstrates that this theological vision appears concretely in prophetic ethics, where animals are recognized as beings worthy of compassion and justice. Farhana Meir expands this through Quranic ecological concepts such as Tawhid, Mizan, and Ayat, showing that the natural world is a sign-filled revelation. Ibrahim Osdemir reminds us that human responsibility is expressed through trusteeship rather than domination. And finally, Anna Gate demonstrates that these ideas continue through lived Muslim environmental practices. Taken together, these scholars reveal that Islamic environmental thought operates across multiple levels: cosmology, ethics, history, spirituality, community practice. Ecology is not one concern among many. It is woven into how Islam understands existence itself. This illustration represents the central transformation that all of these readings invite us to consider. A dominant modern worldview often imagines reality as a hierarchy. Humans stand above nature. Nature exists below humans. Resources exist for human consumption. This framework has produced remarkable technological achievements, but it has also contributed to ecological exploitation by separating humans from the systems that sustain them. The Islamic ecological imagination offers a different model, not necessarily a flat world where all beings are identical, but a relational world where every being has its own place, dignity, and purpose under God. The center of this vision is not humanity, the center is God, Allah. Around that center exists a community of creation: humans, animals, plants, water, mountains, and the wider cosmos. This does not deny human uniqueness. Islam recognizes that humans have particular moral responsibilities. But responsibility does not mean superiority without limits. Instead, human distinction is expressed through accountability. This is the meaning of khilafah and amana. Humanity is honored precisely because it has been entrusted with care. This relational worldview also has implications for environmental justice. If creation is interconnected, the harm to ecosystems inevitably affects human communities, especially vulnerable populations. Ecological destruction is therefore also a moral and social issue. As we bring the lecture towards a conclusion, I want to return to the relationship between Ellen Michael and Ingrid Mattson because together they create a particularly powerful conversation. Michael teaches us that human societies have always existed within ecological relationships. The Ottoman Empire was not simply built upon political decisions or military power. It depended upon the Nile, agricultural systems, labor, animals, and environmental knowledge. Nature shaped empire. While Matson invites us to go further, if humans have always depended upon ecological systems, perhaps this dependence is not accidental or merely biological. Perhaps it reflects something deeper about the nature of creation itself. The Quran presents the world as a community in which every being participates in God's order. Together, this author challenged the assumption that ecology is a modern concern disconnected from religious traditions. They remind us that questions about rivers, animals, forests, and climate are ultimately questions about relationships. What is humanity's relationship with God? What is humanity's relationship with other creatures? And what responsibilities emerge from belonging to a shared world? The ecological crisis requires scientific knowledge, political action, and technological innovation. But these readings remind us that it also requires moral imagination. We need new ways of seeing ourselves, not as conquerors of nature, but as participants within a living creation. I would like to conclude by referring once again to the Quranic verse that has guided this entire conversation. Indeed, verse 38 in Surah Al-An'am explain that all animals and birds are organized communities just like humans. This means animals possess their own distinct ways of life, social structures, instincts, and purposeful existence, just as human societies do. This verse is powerful because it transforms the way we understand our place in the world. To care for creation is not simply environmental responsibility. It is participation in God's covenant of justice, adil, balance, mizan, mercy, rahmah, and trust, amana. The earth is not simply a collection of objects placed here for human consumption. It is a community of communities, all sustained by the Creator and all participating in forms of existence that exceed human understanding. Alan Michael shows us historically that civilizations rise and fall within ecological relationships. The Nile shaped Ottoman Egypt. Water, agriculture, and climate shape human possibilities. While Ingrid Mattson shows us theologically that these ecological relationships are also spiritual relationships. The beings around us are not silent matter. They are communities that glorify God in ways we may not fully perceive. And the other scholars deepen this vision. Syed Hussein Nasir reminds us that recovering the sacredness of nature is essential for healing the modern ecological crisis. While Fajrun Khalid reminds us that climate justice requires moral transformation. And Farhana Meyer reminds us of the Quranic balance embedded within creation. And Ibrahim Ozdemir reminds us that humans are trustees, not owners. And Sarah Tilili reminds us that compassion extends beyond the human community. And finally, Anna Gate reminds us that ecological responsibility must become lived experience. So ultimately, Islamic ecology asks us to recover humility, to care for creation. Is not simply to protect something outside ourselves. It is to recognize that we are already part of a greater community of life, a community that worships, depends upon, and returns to God together. Therefore, the question is not whether humans belong in nature. The question is whether we remember that we have never belonged anywhere else.